Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. I am 43 years old, and until recently, I had never heard of Brian Krock. And that is the truth. But I want to tell you about something that happened to me a couple months ago. I had a week where suddenly, seemingly everybody I talked to was saying to me, "Hey man, have you checked out Brian Krock?" First it was,
"Hey, do you know about this great Brooklyn saxophone player named Brian Krock?"
and I was like, no, I don't know who that is. I am important, and I don't have time for your Brian Krock questions, thank you, but I have some podcasts to make now, and some jingles to write, and some music to produce that nobody will ever hear, so good day, sir. I said good day. And then another person would write to me and say,
"Hey man, have you checked out the band Big Heart Machine? It's this really cool big band project from Brooklyn, and they're like groovy but also very deep and bringing together elements of modern classical music with interesting rhythmic ideas, and they're swinging but they're kind of cheeky and challenging in their own way, and also the brilliant jazz composer James Joyce produced their first studio record, and then they did this cool thing where they rearranged a composition by the great Hungarian composer György Ligeti for big band."
And I was like, "You don't mean the György Ligeti?" And the people were like,
"Yes, that very same one, and you should check out Big Heart Machine."
So I said, fine, and I Googled Big Heart Machine. And it's awesome, but it turns out it's just a Trojan horse for Brian Krock to ride in on because it's Brian Krock's big band project. But at that point, I was busy leasing a car because I was trying to get out of New York for a while to go to Wisconsin and visit my parents in the COVID summer, and I didn't have any bandwidth to dig too deep into all this big heart business before I hit the road. So I drove with my wife and daughter and our dog to Wisconsin, and it's a 15-hour drive, but we made it in 14 because my wife has great legs but a lead foot. And anyway, I got there, and my dad, who's a musician and a journalist and had his own interview show in the 1980s called Talking Jazz, where he interviewed legendary jazz musicians including Miles Davis and Gil Evans, yada, yada, yada. My dad shows me this email that he had just received, and it read, "Dear Ben, I have a YouTube channel called Scorestudy that is dedicated to studying some of the greatest music, and I'm working on a new piece about Gil Evans. I was wondering if I could be allowed to use a short clip of Gil's voice from your Talking Jazz series of interviews. I'm not sure about the legality, and I wanted to personally ask your permission. I want to specifically use a short 15-second clip in which he talks about choosing the instrumentation for Birth of the Cool. Best, Brian Krock." So I was like, man, not even in my parents' house am I safe from this cat. The walls were crocking in on me. Now, I may be stubborn, but I am not impervious to the overtures of the universe. I know how to read a sign. I know how to take a hint. Some people use software to schedule their days, organize their workflow. Other people have assistants. I make lists. I learned it from my dad. Yellow legal pads. Write it all down. I do it every night. Make the list for tomorrow. Recently, I saw a Facebook post by my friend and first ever podcast guest, Will Lee, who shared his own daily yellow legal pad list. And it gave me a feeling of belonging to a great tribe of yellow legal pad list makers. One night while I was in Madison, I wrote down, "Reach out to Brian Krock" on a yellow legal pad. I figured I should probably just get ahead of this thing before it got ahead of me, you know? I woke up the next morning, checked my email, and there, at the top of the list of unread messages that came in overnight, was this subject heading: "Can I use some audio from one of your interviews?" You could see where this is going. Do I even need to finish the... Oh, what the hell, we've come this far. It read, "I wanted to ask your permission to include a short clip of your interview with Jason Moran in a video essay I'm making for my YouTube channel. The context is Anthony Braxton's coded language that he uses to describe his music. The other day I was listening to your interview, and what Jason said about coded language as a power move for black artists really unlocked the code for me. I'd love to include it, and obviously credit you and link to your show in the description. Brian Krock." So one thing led to another, and here we are. This is a good one, you guys. I dig Brian Krock. I'm a fan of Brian Krock. I am a fan of Big Heart Machine. And I have become a total disciple of his Scorestudy YouTube channel. I feel smarter for watching it. I feel enlightened and provoked and challenged and sometimes skeptical and many times grateful, but I always am glad I watched it. This episode fits into a series of ongoing conversations that explore the interaction between our emotional, automatic conceptions of beauty and the theory that informs those conceptions. Previous conversations with other arrangers like Gil Goldstein, Jacob Collier, and Alexis Cuadrado, among others, dig in the same dirt. I don't need to tell you too much more, I don't think, because it's all here. Just visit third-story.com to sign up, subscribe, visit the archive, where you'll find the aforementioned episodes, as well as other conversations that we referenced here, like the ones with Ben Wendell and Jason Moran and Will Lee. On the website, I've also included some videos and a Spotify playlist of music related to our talk here today. Visit my Patreon page, that's patreon.com/thirdstorypodcast, to grease the wheel. And then visit Brian's Patreon page, that's patreon.com/Brian Krock, to really get your big heart machine pumping. Huh? Without further preamble, here's my conversation with Brian Krock.
Hello.
There he is.
Hey, Leo. How you doing, man?
Good. Brian, how you doing?
Good. Your space looks very cool. Looks like a super creative zone.
I appreciate you saying that. But you know what's funny is I spent most of today in a crock hole, and I've been watching all these videos of you. And you know, what's interesting about it is that you come to feel a familiarity with the physical space around somebody, especially when they make videos like you make. So the guitar hanging on the wall behind you. I mean, there's a few spaces that you make videos in, but it is interesting the intimacy that we start to feel with people in their personal spaces because you share it on YouTube.
That's so true. And ever since I started YouTubing, I've become like a lot more self-conscious about making sure my space is like clean and that I like put gear away and stuff. Like it used to be a disaster.
Well, there's still something very soulful about the way you approach it. Like I discovered your videos this year after having discovered a contemporary of yours, Adam Neely's videos. And his videos are very polished in a lot of ways and produced, which is incredibly impressive and, you know, puts all of us to shame when we think that we're multimedia creators. But when I saw yours, I felt that I actually knew more about you and the space that you live in and the way you think about even what's funny to you or what, you know, what's amusing to you. It was a very accessible way into your headspace watching your videos.
Well, first of all, Adam is a close friend of mine, and he's been YouTubing for like 14 or 15 years, like since YouTube started. So he's, you know, his production quality has grown over time. But when the pandemic hit and I made the decision to start trying actively to produce content, he was the first person I called, and his advice was just start with anything. And it's funny that you say this right now, because right before we hopped on this phone call, I was watching Leland Sklar. Do you know Lee Sklar, the bass player?
The bass player, sure, yeah.
His YouTube channel, if you don't follow it already, is just him putting his iPhone up in front of himself, and then it's completely unedited, and he talks about everything and nothing for 2 minutes every day. And it's some of the most addictive content that I've ever consumed. I look forward, he's become a friend, even though I've never met him. I look forward to hearing from him every day. And
weekend,
literally some days it's just like...
It's supposed to cool off a little bit here in LA, which is a relief. Not enough yet, but over the next week it's supposed to drop a little bit more, which is great.
He doesn't have any real goal with his channel. It's just sharing. And it inspires me because it's true. You don't need any skill or any technology to get started on YouTube, at least.
Well, you might not need any skill or technology, but I mean, what you're describing that Lee Sklar is doing is kind of the polar opposite of what you're doing in terms of the intention, because you are very granular and very specific. And, you know, talk about being inspired by different things. You're inspired by this guy who's like, basically, it's all shit personal sharing. I look at your content and I'm inspired by how unafraid you are to get really in the weeds with the understanding that this is not for everybody. When you're doing score analysis on some pretty far out stuff, obscure or abstract writing to begin with, and then you're going to actually go even deeper into it. I mean, for example, your Steve Swallow video where you look at the composition and the inspiration for the composition, and then you check out how he got to the essential building blocks of the melody. That's got to be the deepest score analysis that anybody ever did of a Steve Swallow chart. And I'm just hooked. I'm with you, you know, that it proves that the more willing you are to get specific with the stuff that you care about, it's possible that it could become more compelling, you know, that makes it more compelling.
Yeah. First of all, I really appreciate it. What's interesting about it to me is like last night, I just finished editing my next video, and it's on a really complex, it's such a original idea. I hate to say that because I don't want to sound arrogant or anything, but I've never heard anybody talk about what my next video is about. And I did a lot of research for it and I just couldn't find anything. So I had to create terminology and all of that. I made my fiance sit down and watch it. And, 13 or 14 minutes later, I paused it and I was like, is this making any sense to you at all? Because I'm not able to dissociate from myself enough to. And she said, oh yeah, I'm with you 100% of the way. It makes perfect sense. And then I said, okay, so tell me what the video is about. And she was like, but I don't know. But as you were talking about it, it seemed to be making sense.
Yeah. And
what I'm thinking is that, well, I watch a ton of content that doesn't make any sense to me. Just because I'm interested in, for example, I love watching this one called Actors on Actors, which is like two actors interviewing each other about their craft. I love watching filmmakers and editors and writers. There's all sorts of communities of creatives on YouTube. And I realize even if I know nothing about what they do, I still find it fascinating to hear them talk on their level with their peers. There's a lot to be gained from that. And sometimes I'll go through an entire video and truly not know at all what they're really talking about, but I still am inspired by it. And I still find parallels from what they do that I can apply to my own life. So I'm hoping that on the one hand, they'll at least be entertaining if they don't make sense to people, to the layman. But there is definitely a goal in presenting this kind of really esoteric information, which is that maybe a few people who watch it will start to think along those lines or be inspired to utilize some of these really abstract ideas in their own composing. Like, for example, I think the Steve Swallow example is great because I didn't talk to Steve at all before I made that video about the piece. I just asked him if he would mind if I did it. And when I sent it to him, he was like, you nailed it.
Yeah.
He didn't even remember, but that was how he wrote the piece. But basically what I'm trying to say is that you wouldn't think that Steve Swallow, I'm not exactly sure how to say this because I would never say anything negative about a Steve Swallow composition, but you wouldn't think that Steve was doing anything other than just sort of pouring his heart out. That's what his compositions sound like. So I think it's interesting that there's a lot of math and really deliberate tools that he's using in order to achieve those sounds.
It's also possible that both are happening at the same time, and it raises a question of what the value or the role of analysis is. You got to that Steve Swallow piece because first you did a video on his partner Carla Bley, and in the process of setting that up, you communicated with Steve Swallow and discovered that he was a very accessible and open person. And in your Carla Bley video, which is influenced by this idea of fractals, you say,
it's hard to know how much of the fractal structure for Jesus Maria comes from Carla's conscious design, or rather just from her artistic intuition. But in a way, that simply doesn't matter, because the evidence is all there for us to observe. This is what musical analysis is all about.
Which I thought was an interesting thing for you to say, because math and this theory is happening and it can be useful in your analysis, but it's also possible that she or he was simply pouring their heart out, and that the universe sometimes complies, that what we think is beautiful or interesting is also playing by these mathematical rules.
I'm so glad that you brought that up because I've had a lot of my peers sort of complain to me about that video and say, I mean, many of my friends have said, I just don't buy that. It seems a little far-fetched to me. My general response is, it doesn't matter if you buy it or not. It's just one perspective, and you can have your perspective, and neither of us are right. Analysis is not, at least for me, analysis is not trying to make a definition, because to me that would be totally uninteresting. More what it is trying to have an open-ended exploration. I mean, to me, that's what's beautiful about art, is that it's completely subjective. There's no right or wrong way to interpret a piece of music. And so by sharing my interpretation, which could be way off the mark, it's still a valid interpretation. It doesn't mean that there's no other valid interpretations or other ways to explore, for example, Jesus Maria by Carla Bley. What's interesting too is that Carla, she's not in the best of health, so I couldn't actually speak with her, but Steve passed along a note from her, and she said, I'm just paraphrasing, I don't remember exactly, but she said, I used to think that Jesus Maria was kind of just a frill. It was kind of just a pretty song with not a lot of meat to it. And after watching your video, I'm damn proud to have written it, which obviously meant a lot to me that she would say that. But it's also interesting because she probably wrote that tune in an afternoon. And then I spent weeks tearing it apart and applying my own idiosyncratic view onto it. And I think, at least for me, I made the whole world around that piece a little more robust, even if it was just for myself.
Right.
And that's why I think analysis is a valuable tool for anybody to do, because another goal of my show is to let people know that there's no ivory tower with analysis. You don't have to follow anyone's rules. You can do it your own way and maybe embolden some people to just dive in.
Well, this really speaks to the question that I was thinking about as I watched your analysis. I guess to frame it simply, it was, what is the distinction, or is there a distinction between a YouTuber? I mean, you're also a composer, a musician. You come with already in your relatively young life and career, a long time thinking about these ideas. But what is the difference between you doing this on YouTube and, let's say, teaching these same ideas in a conservatory? Like, is there a more open source or a more creative version of this? Is there something that distinguishes you doing this from the way you would approach it, or somebody would expect to approach it in a conservatory or a university?
I'm going to answer your question sort of through the back door. I've been really nervous in this process because I've only been doing it for a short time. I've been very cognizant about spreading misinformation, because things that you put on the internet are permanent. You can take them off the internet, but other people may have recorded them, or they've got, the internet works that way. So once you upload something, for all intents and purposes, it's permanently there. When I was in school, I had a lot of teachers tell me completely wrong things. Just as one example, recently I got all excited because In the Air Tonight by Phil Collins had a resurgence, thanks to some YouTubers. Interestingly, do you know about that? A couple of
teenagers listening to it for the first time, and when the beat came in, yes, I saw it.
Y'all sleeping on me. Let's wake them up. You heard he said felt like y'all sleeping on me. Let's wake them up. Come on, he ain't kept that, bro. That was cold. I gotta download this to my phone. That was cold how you did that. I ain't gonna lie, Phil. You got me on that. You got me on that one, man. I ain't never seen nobody drop a beat 3 minutes in a song. He dropped the beat at the end of the song, man. I'm dead, bro. But hey, that's funny. That was good, man. That's unique. More definitely, that is true. I never seen somebody drop a beat at the end of the song.
And because of that video, In the Air Tonight hit #1 on the iTunes charts, and it wasn't even #1 when it was released. And Phil Collins made a killing over the period of a couple weeks. That record sold a bunch of physical copies and was in the top of the charts and on all the streaming platforms. And it was just so interesting to me because he had a couple kids who were just hearing the song for the first time 40 years later. I don't know how long ago that was, probably about 35 years ago. And I thought, okay, I'm going to capitalize on the popularity of In the Air Tonight by telling people about this story that I heard in college about that drum fill. And my music theory teacher told me that the reason that that drum fill hits you so hard and it feels like it comes at the right moment is because it comes right at the golden section of the piece. And for listeners who don't know, the golden section is a phenomenon that occurs all throughout nature and in the human body. And it's the number 0.618, and then there's a lot more decimals. And you can achieve that number using Fibonacci's sequence. If you follow Fibonacci's sequence all the way to infinity, it gradually reaches the number 0.618 ... And the ratio between each consecutive number reaches that number. And it's a fascinating phenomenon. Just to give an example of how it occurs in nature or in the human body, there's so many instances of that ratio in the human face. The nose is about a golden ratio between the top of your head and your chin. Your eye is about the golden ratio between your nose and your ear. There's so many of them. It's like it sort of defines how we conceive of beauty. And so I really bought that because my music theory professor told me it. And I thought I would make a video about it to tell people about it. And I did the math myself for the first time. By the way, I've been telling hundreds of people this. Anyone who would listen, I would say, did you know that Phil Collins played, it comes right at the golden section? It absolutely does not. That was completely not true.
How far off is it?
It's pretty off. It's like 10 seconds off. It would be nice if that were true. It might be meaningless, but that's, again,
I mean,
part of
I feel like
analysis.
10 seconds off in a song that is 4 minutes long.
Mm-hmm.
It's within, I want to argue, the margin of error. And to some extent, what I'm thinking is like, well, it's a lie that speaks a kind of truth. Because as you said, our noses are about at the golden mean. I mean, our faces don't play by all the rules of nature, but we recognize that they attempt to play by the rules of nature, and that's why we think they're beautiful. And because he wasn't following the numbers, mathematically, there's intuition that also pulls us in that direction. I mean, I understand you can't make a video about it because you can't say, well, it's almost like that. You're such an analyst of this stuff that, if it doesn't play exactly by the numbers, you're saying, well, it's not true. I think if it's off by 10 seconds, I'm going to give it a pass myself. I mean, I play fast and loose with the numbers, but it feels pretty good to me.
It's got truthiness. And you've kind of convinced me in 15 seconds, because now that I think about it, the golden ratio is an average. It's definitely within probably a standard deviation or so. And so
here's another argument. It's possible. Does it come early or late?
I don't remember. I think it comes late. But then there's a fade out, and I did this math.
That's my argument. The fade out. That's exactly where I was going.
And it still didn't work with the fade out. So, anyways, In the Air Tonight is an absolute masterpiece, and there's a million other things that could be analyzed there. So to me, it felt like talking about the golden mean would be silly,
right? Because
there's so much more at play in that song.
But we got there because you were concerned about spreading misinformation, and that was in response to my question about, are you an educator?
Totally. And I would hope, I mean, it used to be a goal of mine to be an educator, to get one of those gigs that are so rare and so woefully undercompensated and underappreciated. That was sort of my dream for many years. I wanted to be a professor.
Sure.
I would be open to that idea because now I have a whole catalog of lesson plans that I could talk about. But in a way, I think YouTube might be a little hipper than that, because there is no gatekeeper. The education that I was lucky to get cost a lot of money and put me in debt and was very valuable. And I would still recommend that if people have the option to go to school, I would still recommend it. But, as I'm about to say this, I realize I haven't thought about it enough, because also there's a lot of charlatans on YouTube. There's a lot of, I've stumbled on a lot of music theory channels that are teaching absolute garbage that have hundreds of thousands of subscribers. And so in that way, people with degrees, or at least with experience as a professional musician, who have put in the time of working and doing weddings and doing shows or whatever, touring, at least those people sort of have some credentials. In the same way that there's no gatekeeper on YouTube, there's also nothing stopping anybody from creating content, whether it's true or not.
You take a good and you take the bad. It's democratic, and that's the good news, and that's the bad news.
And I hate to say it, and I really don't want to go here in our conversation, but it reminds me of Breitbart. It reminds me of all these alternative news sources who, right after the debate, I saw an article, because I was looking at what was trending on Twitter, and I saw an article declaring that Trump won the debate and that he denounced white supremacy and just like basically completely turned the truth around, because what those hucksters are going for is to increase their clicks. And unfortunately, it's a really insidious and evil thing. And it's the same thing happens on YouTube, but luckily the stakes are much lower in music. So, but again, like I said, I really don't want to go there. It's just been such a really awful time. It's hard not to think about.
It's been a depressing, horrible time to be a human being. It's been a depressing, horrible time to be in America. It's been a depressing, horrible time to be a musician or an independent creative person of any kind. And, you said this thing about how you started doing this work that we've been talking about. We haven't even talked about your other work yet. We're still focused on the YouTube stuff. And in a way, it's kind of the lowest hanging fruit, because it's very easy to get your feet wet and get dirty in the YouTube sphere. The music requires actually some serious concentration and is I think a bigger part of what you do in a lot of ways. But you said that you started doing YouTube stuff when the pandemic hit. What led you at that moment to become a proper YouTuber and to share these ideas that you've obviously been thinking about for a long time?
Well, here's what happened. Early in March, I had a tour that I was looking forward to in Japan, and it got canceled only a couple days before we were supposed to leave. And it's hard to remember now, but in the early stage of the pandemic, none of us knew the seriousness of it. And so I remember sitting around, I was at a gig with a bunch of older musicians, and I was saying, should I cancel this tour or should I try to get a refund for my tickets? And everybody was saying, no, I think you should still go. I think everything will be fine. So that tour got canceled. Immediately after that, I got COVID, and I was sick for like 3 weeks.
You did?
And I didn't think I had COVID when I had it, because it was so new and nobody knew what to expect. I had horrible body aches, and I was fatigued all day, every day for like 3 weeks. And only later did I get tested and find out that I had the antibodies. But during that time, needless to say, I was couch ridden, which feels horrible because you want to be doing things. I want to be helping out around the house. My fiance was waiting on me hand and foot, and I literally couldn't get off the couch. At the same time that was happening, I saw the rest of my schedule for the foreseeable future disappear completely. So I cried a lot of tears, honestly, and was really scared. And then I just decided, once I started feeling better, that I needed something to distract myself. I needed an activity that could benefit my career in some way. And I thought that there would be no loss if I tried the YouTube thing and it failed, because I would learn a little bit about video editing. I would have spent my time analyzing music that I love and have learned a little bit more about music. And so it wouldn't be a wash. It would be a valuable way to spend my time. After I realized that frankly, I enjoy making these videos, but B, it turns out that it sort of fits well within my career, because I'm sure most of your listeners haven't heard of me, so I'll just let them know, like, what I mostly do, it's sort of all of my passions are side hustles in my life, as is the case with a lot of freelance musicians. I've never had an actual job, like a side hustle job. My job has always been musical theater. I'm a woodwind doubler, so I sub on Broadway shows, and I've done a lot of touring with, national tours of Broadway shows.
I read that you wrote the first Big Heart Machine record, or at least most of the early compositions, while you were on the road with a touring Broadway show.
That's true. Now that you mention it, this is making me think that maybe in our darkest hours, some of the best things in our lives occur, because at that time I was touring with Dirty Dancing, the musical. And I don't remember exactly how many shows, but it was well over 1,000 shows I played, 8 shows a week for like 2 years.
Wow.
Because I had student loans that I had to pay off. And I'm really lucky that I had a job, because those kind of touring gigs are few and far between. And so I was grateful to have the job, but I was lonely on the road. I really missed the scene in New York. I missed creativity. I missed playing jazz with my friends rather than playing Dirty Dancing to a click track every single day. It's taxing.
No, I never felt like this before. Yes, I swear it's the truth.
And the challenge of those kind of gigs ends up becoming figuring out a way to sustain yourself mentally. And for me, it turned into writing. The other great thing about being on tour is that you have a lot of free time, because you're really only working from like 7 o'clock until 10 o'clock at night. So I did a lot of writing, and I sort of decided to set aside some of my income and reinvest it in a recording session. And then I wrote music for that. That's how the first Big Heart Machine album came to be. Yeah. So, I mean, I play weddings. I sub on Broadway shows, which is a incredible scene that I feel lucky to have gotten to do. And I really hope it comes back. Those have been the ways that I've made money throughout my career so far. And then my personal projects, Big Heart Machine, my big band, has done nothing but lose me all of my money. And then Liddle, my smaller group, which has done some touring, and we've made a couple records. Those are my passion projects. And I always thought that creating content would be cool, but I just never really had time to do it because I was already busy. So what I'm hoping will happen is that as I'm learning how to do this, I'll figure out a workflow and get quicker at it, and then incorporate it into my life somehow so that I can continue doing both things. Honestly, it doesn't look like gigs are coming back anytime soon. So this is kind of going to be the main hustle for a while.
When I look at your career independent of COVID, the first question that sort of comes to mind is like, how do you structure your life and even your day to accommodate? I saw you, for example, talk about being a doubler in some video or something that you wrote somewhere, where it just addressed what it means to be a doubler, and that in order to be a proper doubler, I mean, you identify yourself as a doubler. Not all woodwind players would say, oh, I'm a doubler. They would say, well, I also have a tenor, but they wouldn't say I'm a doubler. And one of the things that you said is you have to make every one of those instruments your primary instrument at some time in your life. You have to have the relationship with it, that it was like your main squeeze at some point.
Yeah.
So when I saw that you said that, I thought, so what is your life like if you're having to cycle through all these instruments and you're a composer and now you're making all of these videos, and on top of that, really the thing that, and I relate to this because my life is like this too, the thing that actually keeps your lights on, the thing that you actually get paid to do, is the thing that most people never get to see or know that you do. That's the thing you never get to really talk about. So how is your life organized? And I suppose it's changed now in the last 6 months, but I mean, how in general do you think about dividing your time that way?
It's tough. And I've sort of always tried to have this attitude of whatever opportunity that you have to make some income, to do your best job at it. I think it would be a really sad way to live life. There are a lot of people who say to themselves, this gig is just to make some money and I'm not going to give it my best effort. But for me, what sort of happened was I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. I've always been a multi-instrumentalist. I always just sort of enjoyed learning a new instrument. I think everybody likes being at the beginner stage of things because it's fun. You make gains so quickly. When you're at the expert level of an instrument, you are putting in a lot more effort and you're making tiny gains. Sometimes you're just doing maintenance. But when you're just learning a new thing, you start to get really good relatively quickly. And so that's fun and exciting. And so I've just invested in a lot of different instruments just for the fun of it. And then when I moved out here, I naively thought, oh, I'll just see if I'll hit up some of the professionals and see if I can get some work. But when I got here, I found out immediately that the level of woodwind doubling in New York is unreasonable. It's insane. I've been to shows in London. I've worked in Chicago. I've been to shows in LA. There's nothing like there is here. There's people like Scott Robinson. There's people like Charles Pillow. There's names that people won't recognize as readily, but people like Ben Kono or one of my good friends, a guy named Brian Krock.
Really?
These guys
You have a friend named Brian Krock, who's a doubler also?
Yeah, he has the woodwind chair for the Book of Mormon, and he was one of the first people to sort of show me the ropes. And but that's a whole nother story. These guys are ridiculous. Charles Pillow plays all of the woodwind instruments at a professional level, so that professional oboe players respect him and think he's a great oboe player, and also professional piccolo players and flute players and bass clarinet players. You know, he plays at a professional level on all the instruments. So I hit him up for lessons, and he was like, well, you obviously can't practice every instrument every day.
Right.
So you have to pick one to be your main axe and give it a period of a few years where that's your main axe.
A few years.
The point being, I used to worry when I was younger, like all this other shit that I'm doing. Is it okay if I swear? I hope
all the time.
doesn't.
Do it, please. Yes.
So anyways, I used to worry like all this stuff is taking time away from what I really want to be doing, and therefore probably limiting my success at composing and playing the saxophone, because that's what I really want to do. But as I thought about it, and as time has passed on, I've realized that each of these things is teaching me more about what I do. You know, and this is super esoteric, woodwindy stuff, but practicing clarinet is the best thing you could do to practice saxophone. Practicing flute is an incredible thing to do to practice your breath support. Practicing oboe, you learn so much about reeds and how reeds work, because the reeds are a lot more finicky. You learn a lot more about finger dexterity, because the design of the instrument is such that you really have to be in control of your fingers. My point being, all of these things teach you more about saxophone. And the same thing, you know, now that I'm working on editing, even though I've been doing it only for a short time, editing video and recording video and lighting and all of these things are really inspiring me. I watched The Godfather the other day, and the whole time I felt like a joke, because I was literally being like, holy fuck, The Godfather is the best movie ever. This is the framing of these shots and the dialogue and the editing, and like I'm seeing everything in a new light. I think it's good to be actively involved in things that you're a beginner at.
I love that idea, that's where that real creative excitement happens, when we really don't know. And it's just all new to us. We get to be like children again in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
And it's interesting to hear you say that you have often told yourself that the main thing that you want to be doing is playing saxophone, because it's not clear to me in looking at your overall picture. Not that there has to be a dominant thing. I mean, I think it's a foolish question sometimes to say, well, what's the main thing? What's the real thing? I think it's even a question to ask, you know, well, which is the side hustle and which is the hustle? Because it's kind of all a hustle, you know? When
I look at my biggest heroes of all time, they all seem to be people who have their hands in a lot of different activities. Like, for example, an huge early influence was John Zorn. And I love about John Zorn that he just can do whatever he feels like doing. And if that's writing an orchestral composition, that's one way to express his world. If that's aggressive Ornette Coleman tribute band, that's another part of his world. If it's collaborating with death metal artists, that's another part of his world. It's all him. And that's true for most of the people I look up to. Anthony Braxton, you know. It's pretty much everybody that I look up to has to, just for financial reasons, have a few different hustles going. There's very few people in the world like Hilary Hahn comes to mind. She can make a living just playing violin, but there's very few people who can do that. And I'm certainly never going to be one of them. I'm not particularly talented at any of the things I do. I just love them, and I spend a lot of time on them. So yeah, and I feel fortunate because I think it has made the scene that I'm a part of, it's made my world pretty deep and robust. I enjoy doing a lot of different things.
I think that by asserting yourself into the world of big band composition as having a big band, you occupy a much less densely populated space than if you are asserting yourself into the world of being even a composing saxophone player. That would put you in one space. But because you have this big project, which, as you say, is like a money suck, it's got to be impossible to assemble that many people regularly. It must be so challenging. Mm-hmm. And yet it puts you in a much more rarefied space.
I like that you say I asserted myself into that scene, because that's exactly what it is. Nobody's gonna... There's a few exceptions. I think my mentor, as far as big band composition goes, a gentleman named Jim McNeely, is an exception to the rule, because he was a guy who literally had Bob Brookmeyer saying, you need to write big band music for the Village Vanguard Orchestra. And he did it because it was requested from him. But for the most part, if you want to write big band music, you got to be the person to make it happen. Nobody's asking for that. So that's exactly what I did. And the only reason I really did it, I mean, maybe the listeners and you can relate to this feeling, but honest to God, making a big band record was one of those moments in my life that I pretty much daily was saying, is this the stupidest mistake that I've ever made? Am I ruining my life? Because it was very, very foolish. I had no idea how much of a time suck and a money suck it would be. And I felt a lot of dread and anxiety about setting myself up for it. I'm glad I did it when I did, because as a young person, you can make it over those hurdles. But as an older person with responsibilities to other people, I don't think that I could really rationalize deciding to make a big band record.
It must be so intense to have taken 2 years of your life, and you went out in the Dirty Dancing Roadshow, tried to pay off some student debt, saved some money, and then you take this money that you've saved. It took 2 years, and then you go, and in the space of, how many days was that session at Systems 2?
2 days, and then all that money was gone. Yeah, that was scary. And I remember talking to my dad about it, and he was like, well, Brian, you've really got balls. I think what he was really thinking was like, you're an idiot. But no, that's not fair. I'm sure he admired the chance taking. I might not have done that if I didn't go on tour with a Broadway show, because I've also done really exciting tours with jazz groups, or I did a great tour with Mark Morris Ballet that was super inspiring. It's fun when you're on the road with creative types, because you're constantly sharing ideas and you're going to explore the cities and check out the music scene where you are and stuff like that. But when you're on a Broadway tour, it's like you go back to the hotel, you have a couple drinks at the hotel bar, and you go to bed kind of thing. And it's really, really awful. At least that was my experience. I think it was lucky because I realized this is what I'm going to keep doing unless I force myself out of here somehow. But yeah, the world of big band composition is crazy, but I think it's nice to have long range projects like that, where in order to generate an album's worth of music for a big band, you have to write for months and months, sometimes years and years. Then to organize a session, you have to do it probably a year in advance, because people's schedules and finding spaces that are big enough. And now, post-COVID world, who knows how big band records are going to get made. But it's good to have those totemic, overarching goals, something that you're going to work towards for a long time, and you're going to have to save up a lot of money for, because they give you some sort of direction to your life. That's really what making records, at least for me, that's what making records seems to be. It's giving myself a goal and also documenting a time period, and keeps me moving, and I guess distracted too,
Right. So you mentioned that you were born in Wisconsin, you grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. Are you a twin?
Yeah, I'm a twin. He doesn't look anything like me. I'm not going to mention his name because he's a very private person, and he's a lawyer. We are in many ways complete opposites. But yes, I have a twin, and he was a child prodigy musician as well. And that was an interesting person to grow up alongside.
Were you also?
No. He has special gifts and also his own struggles because of those gifts. And one of the things is that he just has an insane aptitude for music. So when we were in kindergarten, he could sit down and at the piano and play things by ear. And by the time we were, I don't remember how old we were, maybe fourth grade, he was touring with a orchestra as a clarinet soloist playing the second Weber clarinet concerto. I remember going to see him when I was in fourth grade, and he was like this little kid in front of a group full of professional adult orchestral musicians. And I was sick with anxiety that he was going to make a mistake, and he didn't. And then, he ended up not having any interest in pursuing music as a career because I think it was just so easy for him. But it was also very frustrating for me because I loved music and I struggled at it. Like I remember us going to piano lessons together, and he would literally pass in one lesson. He would pass through an entire method book, and I would have to go home and continue working on the same one simple exercise, that kind of a thing. So I really grew up thinking that I sucked, even though I was probably just normal,
Or probably good, probably pretty good.
Or pretty good, yeah. I was comparing myself to an absolute freak. I mean, this was a kid who a car would drive by and honk their horn, and he would go, "That's a C sharp 3, but it's 20 cents sharp," Truly unbelievable talent. But yeah, he's a lawyer in Chicago.
Being a professional musician today, how does it feel to devote your life to this thing, having grown up with an actual prodigy genius, and know that he has chosen not to be a musician? I mean, it must be a very strange thing. You said this thing earlier. I'm sorry, I'm cutting off my own question, but you said this thing earlier where you said, well, I'm not particularly talented at any of the things that I do. I just care a lot about them. And it stood out to me when you said that. And I thought, well, I don't think that that's true. And I wonder why you say that. And I think maybe part of the reason you say that is because you grew up next to somebody who clearly had this like supernatural gift.
Yeah. And frankly, it's true that I'm not particularly talented. You live in New York, you see 18-year-olds who can get on stage and play with Wynton Marsalis and slay rhythm changes in all 12 keys. And that's shit that I can't do, and I probably never will be able to do. Thank God I was introduced to the scene in Brooklyn where I saw people like Tim Byrne, or I saw people like Oscar Noriega. I saw another way, that you don't have to be this prodigal talent, that you can choose to create your own world. And that seemed a lot more interesting to me when I moved out here. But I can guarantee you those people would probably also say, yeah, I'm not particularly talented. They just are artists. One of my big heroes is the piano player Matt Mitchell. Mm-hmm. He's really always working on his modular synthesis, which he's by no means an expert at. But I think that those kinds of sounds are informing his sound world. So when he sits at a piano, he's got a new perspective. For me, maybe I'm doing this more unconsciously, but, writing for a big band, then when I go to play music with my quartet, I'm bringing all of those tools with me into that music. As a saxophone soloist, I talk about Jim McNeely too much, so this is my last time. But one of the things he taught me was like sitting down at the piano and improvising like a composer.
I love this idea. I want you to talk about this a little more. I think about this a lot, about where improvisation and composition meet. I think it's like an under-discussed idea.
I agree. I think a big part of that is the sort of unintentional consequences of this capitalist nature of the music education system, where we're trying to, not we, because I'm not involved with it, but people are trying to give kids a package that they can perfect and feel that they've learned something. And unfortunately, that's not how music works at all. And so I think that has a lot to do with why we're still kind of teaching kids bebop, and those are great, valuable things to learn, but they're also easy to teach because they're formulaic to a certain extent, and you can essentially pass those things. You can get an A on playing a rhythm changes. You can't really get an A on playing a good jazz solo, you know? And so consequently, there aren't a lot of teachers, I think, that end up talking as abstractly as McNeely does, because you can imagine a situation where people are feeling like they're not getting any information, because a lot of the real teachers will just say shit like, you got to feel it, or you got to hear it, or you just got to live your life. And you know, and those things are so true, but they don't feel like you're being given something, you know,
in a transactional sense, in a sense that that you're getting what you paid for.
Yeah. You want to be able to point to something at the end of, if you go to Juilliard, you know, if you, at the end of 4 years and whatever it is, $160,000 or something, you better be able to point and say, this is what I got from this education.
I talked to Ben Wendell a few years ago about what it was like to play with Billy Higgins in LA coming up, because there was this place, the World Stage, this club that Billy had, and young musicians could sit in with him. And he said, I learned so much from him. And I said, well, what did you learn? And he said,
just through playing and never explicitly saying anything, just through hanging with him and getting to play with him, he showed me a vision of music and the joy of music, and maybe a vision of this thing that we call jazz, which is, that word itself is kind of controversial, but he kind of showed me in this weird symbiotic way. I mean, everybody feels this way that got to play with him. He kind of showed you the secret by playing with him. Mm-hmm. And that on all that time, he never told me one thing. He never, quote unquote, taught me something explicitly. He never said, do this, don't do that. When he passed, I was thinking to myself of this whole idea of like the oral tradition in any culture, in anywhere in the world, whether it be musical or otherwise. And that was the first time that it hit me that, oh man, like there's a reason that there's this thousands-year-old tradition of like a mentor and a student and passing on knowledge and information through craft, and how that's getting interrupted. Because what he showed me, I cannot write it down in words and then give it to someone and then they'll understand. Like I would need to show someone else musically what he showed me.
Right. And that's such a vague thing. And it's hard to, like, you can't codify it. You can't put it into a packet and hand it out to your students and say, this is how you improvise like a composer. Although probably, I mean, blanket statements are, to make a blanket statement, blanket statements are always wrong. Mm-hmm. But anyways, I think most of the great improvisers do this. And the only way to work on it really is actually to write. You can't practice composing by improvising, you know? But it would be really hard for me to try to explain what improvising like a composer might mean. It involves having a really, you know, training your memory. This is something that I worry about a lot, actually, is my own memory and the world's collective ability to focus for a long enough time to where music that requires you to draw on your memory, will that be valid? Like when I was a kid, I used to love to sit down with a record of, say, an opera and listen to it for 3 or 4 hours and try to remember the main themes and try to remember, you know, the tonalities and the form, and to feel how it builds to the larger structure. And now I you know, can barely get through my friends' 45-minute long albums before I get distracted, unfortunately. I hate to say that.
Well, it's interesting when somebody like you says that, because you do make music that requires attention. You write music that often demands, maybe not 45 minutes, but, you know, 10 minutes at a time, really entering deeply into a thing in order to understand, you know, what's happening.
That sort of enters into another part about just sort of engaging with art. I want to create artwork that, I don't want to say forces, but invites people to put forth some effort, because in my life, the most profound experiences that I've had engaging with art have been because I've engaged with a challenge. One example, because we were talking about Steve Swallow before, and Steve and I are both big James Joyce fans, and that was one of the first things that we bonded about. Probably the most profound experience that I've had engaging with one piece of art was reading Ulysses. And that was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I mean, it involved buying multiple textbooks to help me be able to understand what I was reading, and forcing myself to sit down for like 3 or 4 hours every day with a pencil. And really, I was like, I really want to understand this book before I die, because people have told me that it's great. I want to know why it's great. So I decided to put forth that effort. And there were times where it felt like a slog. There were times that it felt that I wanted to quit. But by the time it was over, I was left with this feeling of mysticism, of the capabilities of the human mind. This feeling like I'm not pushing myself enough. And neither is anybody around me. Yeah. And we could be doing such grand things. And there's something just so beautiful just in the effort that Joyce put into the writing. Anyways, it might be a little over the top, or sort of arrogant isn't the right word, but it's a lot to say to yourself, I want to do something like that. It's overambitious at the least. But that's truly how I approach a lot of that writing, is like, I want to make this as potentially as deep of an experience for somebody as that, When
you made your first Big Heart Machine record, Darcy, James argued you both, he produced the studio one.
The studio one, yeah.
And then you made a live record also at the Jazz Gallery. But Darcy, James argue, was interviewed for part of the EPK of that Big Heart Machine record, and he said something about you and framed it in the kind of context of your generation, because he's older. He said, what I recognize in this new generation of musicians and writers is that they are drawing from a broader set of influences, and that there's a real interest in trying to bring together this diversity in influence. Everything from putting jazz and modern classical music in the same world, but also hip hop and rock and roll, that they can all sort of live in one space. I completely agree with him. And so I'm in my early 40s. I have been feeling that way about my own cohort since we were younger. But it is true that the lines were more defined, I think, for us. So it's not necessarily a new phenomenon to be into a lot of stuff. I mean, unless you just totally grew up with your head in the sand and only listening to the one thing. But like, it does feel like your generation is the generation that has been allowed itself to really bring that stuff together. And within that generation, you are, in the big band context, among the first.
I think if you were to ask a lot of my colleagues or friends, I'm probably one of the more close-minded of my peers. Like, in the tour van, people want to listen to music, and I'm like, this stuff sucks. Can't we just listen to and then luckily I've got very open-minded friends who'd be like, I don't know, Brian, I think you're being harsh and maybe you should just live with it a little longer. And I don't think I'm particularly open-minded is all I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
I do think that that it's true of my generation, and it may have something to do with the availability of the music, on YouTube, and before that on just on the internet, to where if you heard somebody you respect talking about something, you could pretty much immediately find it. And back then, immediately would mean like finding it on an online store and ordering it and waiting for a few weeks or whatever. But now it's just like at the click of a finger. But I don't know if I'm qualified to speak about it, because I'm really not that open-minded. Like my interests are pretty narrow, I think. I like a lot of things and I'll listen to a lot of things, but what I want to do is pretty narrow, I guess.
So let me reframe it then, because, you're not writing, like, for example, my friend Michael Lenhart has this project called the Michael Lenhart Orchestra, where they'll just straight up do like, big band arrangements of hip hop tunes and do like a Wu-Tang Clan thing, and then followed by like some Quincy Jones charts. And then, he's really like, and he's not your generation. He's my generation, but he's weaving in a lot of popular culture references. He's using his big band format to do a different thing. You, however, are allowing yourself to take classical music and classical music from the 20th century. I mean, particularly Ligeti, who I don't know very much about at all, and say, you know what, this is one of my passions. I love this composer and I love this big band format, and I am going to give myself permission to reimagine and reorchestrate this stuff for a big band, which, although it maybe doesn't seem like a radical thing to do because, as you say, they're kind of narrow influences that you're drawing from, it's still, I think, maybe a function of where you're coming from generationally.
First of all, just a little personal anecdote. When I met my fiance now, almost 5 years ago,
yeah,
she was babysitting for Michael Leonhardt. I remember it came out one day, like she was going to babysit and I was like, her dad's a musician and maybe you'd like his music. I was like, who is it? She was like, Michael Leonhardt. I was like, what? And actually, Carolyn is a student of mine. I haven't seen her since the pandemic started, but she's studying composition with me.
Really?
So, yeah. But I've never met Michael, and I really admire him, really look up to him. I think that he has a right to incorporate those influences into his music because he works within those spheres. He's really living it. For me, like when I listen to hip-hop that I love, like when I listen to like Kendrick or J Dilla or MF Doom or whatever, I don't want to incorporate the exterior of the music. I want to incorporate the process, I want to incorporate the way that those people architect their music, the way they think, the way that they feel the music. I don't think I could ever imagine having like 808s on one of my tracks,
right,
because that would feel inauthentic. But I did write a piece of music that was directly inspired by Dilla because I was so blown away by the feel of his grooves, and I wanted to recreate that in my own way. But man, I would love to know more about pretty much anyone's creative process. For many, like I also don't think that like I really have quote unquote a right to arrange a piece by Ligeti, but I just was so inspired by it, and the way that things are turning socially, I just think more and more about my decision making in terms of like cultural appropriation or what is like really being true to my background. I don't remember how I heard this, but I remember Ethan Iverson. I think he probably just said it to me, but maybe I read it on his blog or something. I just remember him saying one time, like, Minnesota has got a vibe, and a Minnesota blues is a thing, he was, and
oh man, it is true. There's a part of my life as a drummer. I came up in the Midwest in Wisconsin playing the drums. And when I first moved here, so I played drums growing up, and my dad is a piano player. I played with him for years. And when I first moved here, I played a gig relatively early on with a bass player who was from somewhere in Michigan. And he said to me at the set break, I can tell you're from the Midwest. He said there's like a Great Lakes pocket. And I don't disagree with him, man. I mean, Minnesota has its own thing, but I also think that there's like Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan kind of approach to swing that is real. I suppose it raises questions about, so is that our culturally authentic space?
As is so often the case, though, like, I don't know if you feel this way being such a public figure and speaking so often, but the whole time I was talking just then, I was also thinking to myself, like, you haven't thought about this enough.
Oh.
Like, maybe you shouldn't be formulating an opinion yet.
So Ligeti is a white European Jew. So
right.
Is it appropriate for you to appropriate from him, but not from J Dilla because he's more closely aligned with your bio material?
Right. What an interesting line of inquiry, because like the things that have inspired me about Ligeti are almost extra musical. I'm inspired by the fact that some of the most genius work that he made, he wrote for the drawer. He wrote behind the Iron Curtain in a very hostile environment towards things that were deemed too modern, too Western. And so he wrote a lot of music thinking that it would never get heard, thinking that he would put it in the drawer, close the drawer, and that would be it. That is like one of the main things about Ligety, even more than his music, that inspires me.
So speaking of lines of inquiry and the Midwest, something occurred to me today in thinking about you and the company that you keep, your influences, the tradition that you belong to, that you have asserted yourself into. And I want to see if I can make this point in the way that it occurred to me. You know, when it comes to arranging, especially arranging for big band, often trombone players make great arrangers. They sit in the middle of the ensemble. They hear everything around them. The range of the trombone itself is kind of in the middle of the spectrum, so they hear and understand the function of harmony in the overall musical picture. Trombone players are not necessarily protagonistic, not the ones that the average listener pays attention to, but without them and the function in the band, the music wouldn't work in the same way. The harmony wouldn't hang together in the same way. And I started thinking, I wonder if there's a parallel argument to be made about geography. And the reason I was thinking about that was because of how many great big band composers and arrangers have come from the Midwest, the middle of the continent. Maria Schneider, Ryan Truesdell, you, all from the upper Midwest.
Jim McNeely
from Illinois, too, exactly, all from the upper Midwest. And in fact, Gil Evans was Canadian. Is there something about being from the middle of the country, in between both coasts, looking outward, having maybe a different perspective on the music and on the world in general?
That's so interesting, and definitely something I've thought about a lot. If only because a connection to another Midwestern person is an immediate bond, you know? So like when I moved out to New York, I just immediately connected with McNeely, and I started working for Maria maybe a year ago now via Ryan Truesdell.
Yep.
And Maria and I clicked, like we just talk on the phone for like an hour, and because it's just a comfortable vibe, you know. When we were talking about the Midwest before, I thought of the fact that it's a very good place to be learning jazz because people are so kind. So like some of the cats who are a little bit older than me, some that come to mind are Greg Ward. I don't know if you know about him at all, or Marquise Hill.
Yeah, sure.
These were people that you could stand next to in a jam session, even though you had no business doing so, play terribly, and then they'd come off the bandstand and they'd go, "Oh, you're doing a great job, man. Keep working at it. Have you ever checked this out?" And they were just very kind. And there is something to that in the Midwest. I always felt encouraged coming up. I never felt discouraged. I never felt that I wasn't welcome in a club or on stage. And I think that if I had come up in New York, it might have been different, because even today, still being a professional, I still feel vibed by people that I look at, you know what I mean?
Oh man, it's a vibe central. No, I mean, when I talked to Philip Dizak a couple weeks ago, who came up in Milwaukee, he said the thing about Milwaukee is it was big enough that there were some good players, but small enough that anybody could sit in. And I related to that.
Yeah, exactly. And Jeff Cesario said the same thing, and I related to that so deeply because it's just so true. Like, you're comparing yourself. I mean, and also in Chicago, we had true masters, Von Freeman. We had living legends that you could just go see. My dad would take me to the showcase for whatever, $12.
Yep.
And you could go see true masters. Even like in my situation where I wasn't quite ready to understand why that was, I got a little bit of exposure. I got a little taste.
Yeah.
And I got to go up and say hi to these people, and they were nice, like
in some ways, I think there's more opportunity just to play if you can play in Chicago. You have to play a lot of different kinds of things, but I think that there's more crossover.
There's a lot of an older generation of musicians who are fascinating because they are incredible players, but they sort of turned away from the hustle. And so they haven't put out a lot of records, or they just aren't household names. But if you live in Chicago, everybody knows who these guys are. And they're so accessible. And the level of playing is really, really high. But like I said, it's not cutthroat. So a nerdy little white kid from the suburbs was welcome. I think Chicago is actually one of the important scenes today, just as much as New York and London are. I mean, just the names that I mentioned are really influential right now. Marquise Hill,
yes,
Greg Ward, and then Steve Coleman, of course, a generation before that, and people from the AACM who are, Nicole Mitchell, and, so I think Chicago is really important.
Were you influenced by Henry Threadgill and the AACM? Is that something that was part of your early formation?
Absolutely. I've seen Threadgill so many times, but I've never had the courage to say hello, even though he seems like such a kind gentleman. But I just have no idea. It's one of those situations where his music hits you in the most visceral way, and I don't have the slightest clue what the inner workings of his music are. And Threadgill influences me in the exact same way that Ligeti does. The AACM is the exact same situation to me. They didn't really have anybody throwing them a bone in the 70s and the 80s, They were given no opportunities, and they made those opportunities. They made records that weren't being sold. They put on multimedia productions that weren't being attended. They just did it. They were working against a much bigger complex of problems. Not much bigger. They were working on a very different complex of problems. What was oppressing them was, as far as I can tell, racism in the structure of both the classical community and the jazz community.
Mm-hmm.
These were sort of pariahs that didn't fit into any scene. And so more than the actual music has inspired me, the figures and their dedication and work ethic, philosophy is what inspires me.
Along similar lines, I know Anthony Braxton, who you mentioned already here today, has played a big part in your thinking and your music as well. And part of what you have talked about on your YouTube channel is not only his music and his approach, but also the way that he does or doesn't fit into the larger conversation around jazz and jazz education today.
Yeah. And as recently as 2007 or 2008, I remember a professor at the University of Illinois just flagrantly mocking Anthony's music and laughing at it. And I remember being so pissed off. There's just so much disdain still towards this man who is just painfully obviously beyond genius. Same thing with Sun Ra. There's a disdain towards that music. There's I don't even know how to describe it, but it's because I don't understand what they're doing, it must be bullshit, or something like that. Whereas these gentlemen, Muhal as well, whoever else you want to name, Threadgill, they're coming at it from a standpoint of generosity and wanting to improve humanity and wanting to share this knowledge that they've come across through intense study and practice. And the more I think about it, the more it makes me mad, because if these were the people who had been in charge during the surge of music education in the 90s and the 2000s, I think music would be a lot different right now. There would be a lot more, well, I don't want to speculate, but I can definitely say music would be a lot different right now.
I saw on one of your videos, you talked to a bass player who I don't know, Kim Cass. Is that his name?
Kim Cass. Yeah, you should talk to Kim Cass sometime.
He, sang all of these incredible rhythms, polyrhythms and things. And I interviewed Jacob Collier years ago, and he was somebody also who could do that. He could play two things in different hands and be singing a third thing. And And he came to the same conclusion that Kim came to, which is that you study these rhythmic subdivisions in order to reach a more organic feeling in your playing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in Collier's example, he was very focused on the J Dilla thing and trying to make mathematical sense of why that swung in the way that it did and why it felt so funky. And I personally have had my questions and doubts about that ever since I talked to him, because sometimes it's just feels right. And then it turns out it's pretty close to the math.
Jacob Collier and Kim Cass are, from my perspective, coming at the thing from such different motivations. And as soon as you started talking about the ability to tap crazy rhythms, the first thing that I thought of was David Varelis. Because he is also coming at it from a third different vantage point. And I've seen him in the context of Steve Coleman's master classes, which used to happen either at the Jazz Gallery or Seeds, where Steve would instruct David. Like in one instance, David just walked in late to a master class, and Steve was like, David, play a cycle of 13 in your right hand, and then play a cycle of 17 plus 5 in your left hand, and let's see when they converge.
Wow.
And then David literally went up to the wall and was like, da, tu, ge, ti, gu, ti, gu, ti. And because it was such a long cycle, he was doing it for like what felt like ages, but it was probably like 45 seconds. It was a long cycle. And then he just went, ba, tiki, ba. And he's like, that's where they meet up. And we were all just like, even Steve was like, I remember what Steve said, because he was like, because David grew up in this culture where rhythm was paramount and the complexity in the groove was a given, you know? So it just comes naturally to David. Whereas with Kim Cass and a lot of his group of people who I've been fortunate that because I showed interest in their music, those guys let me practice with them and let me like read their music. Cause Kim has a whole group of peers who are just interested in, like you said, the organic possibilities of these crazy rhythms. Like another great drummer who lives in Brooklyn named Sam Ospovit. He's really good with this stuff. And him and Kim will have these like marathon sessions where they shed. Like I remember I came to one of their practice sessions and Kim goes, hey man, all right, cool. So how are your 13s? And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, well, we're working on this right now. And it's like 13 with like nested quintuplets and whatever. And I could not hang at all, but I just sort of stood there and listened to them do it for a couple hours.
So in talking about Gil Evans, you find this quote that Gunther Schuller said about the Claude Thornhill band, and most of those were Gil's charts, where he referred to it as a musical aphrodisiac.
And that's hilarious.
You thought that was so funny. You couldn't say it without cracking up. And I thought, what's so funny about saying that this music is seductive? In the context of score analysis, when you introduce the idea that this music might also turn people on, it's so funny. Now, it may also just be that it's funny for you to have to look in the camera and say this.
It's more that it's funny that Gunther Schuller said it. because I met Gunther Schuller. I actually was his like chaperone for a day at this festival. So I took him around wherever he needed to go and got to spend an entire day with him. And to think of him as a sexual, it's almost like thinking of your parents as sexual beings or thinking of your grandparents as it's just funny to me to think of Gunther Schuller as a sexual being. I don't know. That still cracks me up, but I get what you're saying, of course.
Now I understand. And I totally get it. It just seemed to me that in the context of looking at what makes this music operate, looking at some of the, mechanisms that are informing it, every now and then you're able to say, like you said about Carla, like, she probably was just speaking from her soul, and we can later on apply these rules to it. But one thing that the analysis isn't able to do, or isn't prioritizing, is the function or the role of the music in our lives, how it interacts with the rest of our lives. And while analysis is able to provide some explanation, some rationale for why our bodies respond the way they do, why we physically and emotionally react when we hear certain voicing, certain sounds, certain combinations. It isn't able to account for what the music does to us in our lives, how it affects the rest of the world around us, or how it affects us in the world. And obviously, all of these are strategies to get to that. I mean, all of this is a way of trying to unlock our emotional response in some way or another. But I guess I just wanted to put that in front of you because both are true at the same time. As we established at the beginning of the conversation, both things can be true at the same time. And what do we make of a music that today is, in its way, getting more and more esoteric and further removed from the possibility that somebody else might refer to it as a musical aphrodisiac 30 years from now?
I'll say this. I've never been the guy that at a wedding just can't help himself and jumps up and starts dancing. What turns me on is usually more intellectual.
Yep.
And I just think what you just said is so absolutely interesting and so very true. But I think that it's much harder to pin down that thing that makes something a musical aphrodisiac. It's another level of mysticism and spirituality. And how do you describe that? How do you put that into words? It's not quantifiable. So how do you have a discussion about it? And then again, when you said that it seems like music's getting more and more esoteric, could that be a function of the education system that many of us came up in? Where how do you teach kids who don't know these feelings, haven't had like the type of child who is going to become good enough to go to a Juilliard or a Manhattan School of Music? I'm going to tell you, those kids aren't experimenting with the more lascivious parts of life. Those kids aren't doing drugs and going out to clubs and, sneaking out of their house at 2 a.m. and stuff.
Which is so funny because the older generation, so many of them, when you talk to them, I mean, I'm talking about generation like in the, that came through the 60s or whatever.
Sure.
Even the ones that made the most significant impact on the music, so many of them talk about that they started playing to get girls.
I'm reading a book right now about Tad Dameron, and that dude lived life hard. We all know about stories of people who have children all over the world and who this thing and the next, and yet they have a direct line to this genius well. I guess as I'm talking about it, I'm just realizing maybe part of the reason that you're potentially perceiving it as missing from a lot of the music today is because it is so hard. It is so ephemeral, and it is like, it's something that you truly just need to experience. There needs to be a lot of years behind you. A lot of the things that generation of people were doing, those opportunities aren't available anymore to go on the road and to be on the road all year long. There's good and there's bad about that. How do they pass that on? You can talk about the nuts and bolts. That's why I'm focusing on it, because it's something that is pretty cut and dry, relatively cut and dry.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, I feel like I have a million contradictory thoughts coming into my brain right now, because there's a lot of music being created today. It's just not maybe in the sphere of the Brooklyn jazz scene that's like just really gutturally sexual and, all of these things like that are important in music,
Of course. The reason it stood out to me in the context of Gil Evans' charts is that I think a lot of the music that is guttural and sexual today is not going to be subject to the kind of a level of analysis that a Gil Evans chart is subject to. And that there was a moment when both were happening at the same time. When the music that stands the test of time, that you can get equally giddy about looking at how, it's not a fair comparison because we're talking about the Thornhill charts, and you get excited about later Gill's charts, but the fact that he would write French horns high and flutes low is like obviously something that gets you very excited. I don't blame you. I think that's a wonderful thing, really a wonderful legacy. But that same music, even Porgy and Bess, Birth of the Cool, Sketches of Spain, that those records are very sensual, and that they make lovers feel a certain way when you put it on, and yet they also stand up to the kind of analysis that you like to do, that both can be true, and that somehow in this sphere, not that it's not happening, it is happening, but that, as you say, there's guttural sexual music that's happening today, and then there's that, and they both happen, but they don't happen often together.
Leo, god damn, you're a thoughtful person. While you were saying all of that, I was thinking to myself, because you asked me what was it like to grow up with a brother who was a prodigy. It made me think, what was it like to grow up with a dad who's Ben Sidran? Because these lines of inquiry, to be quite frank, I haven't thought of that much. I haven't spent much time thinking about that. I would be being completely dishonest if I tried to characterize myself as anything other than a relatively sheltered, middle-class white guy. I have not experienced the apex and the nadir of the possibilities of a life, you know what I mean? But I do think that there's a danger in romanticizing those things. But god damn, is that an interesting point of view that, and it's so true. I would think that if you were putting on a John Zorn record when you were trying to get down with your lady, you're a really weird motherfucker. You know what I'm saying?
No, for sure. But I think I learned something from your man, your Hungarian guy.
Liggity.
I learned something from Liggity in one of your videos. I learned something from Liggity, which is that his take on jazz is that it belonged to everybody, that it was the first truly international musical form, that it absorbed all of the influence, that it could accommodate all of it.
It imposed a combination of influences. It is not African, nor Irish, nor French, not even American. It's everything altogether. The first musical expression to be multicultural. I find it very interesting because it is spontaneously creative, distant to today's commercial phenomenons that are designing popular culture.
So I think whatever you want to call the music that you're making, jazz or not jazz, sexual or not sexual, intellectual or not intellectual, there's room for all of it. I'm not saying that it has to be one thing or the other. It just occurred to me.
Yes. To me, it's clear that what a society chooses to value in its artwork just has such an immense impact on what music gets or what artwork gets created. And for Liggity, he was coming up in a world where Pierre Boulez and Urkam and ultra-modernism, high modernism, those things were valued. Guys like Boulez and Stockhausen were becoming extremely wealthy, creating that kind of music because that's what society deemed worthy. Meanwhile, in so much American music, we don't have institutional support for people like the creators of the AACM, but also just for any sort of, there's just this, definitely an anti-intellectualism. That's very obvious that America does not value deep thought generally, culturally. And at the same time, we don't seem to value the creators. And so a lot of these people end up living marginalized lives. And a theme of all of my videos so far seems to have been that these people who are creating some of the most brilliant music that I've ever come across are living in poverty, really struggling through their entire lives. And it's infuriating. All this to say, like you said, I'm a relatively young person. I want to learn from people like Jason Moran or your father, advocates, people who are really doing the hard work to right that wrong, to put these people up on a pedestal, to support them. How many fucking Kickstarter campaigns and Indiegogo campaigns have we seen for the elders of this particular form of art who can't afford their healthcare?
Yeah.
It makes you furious, and it doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon in this country. But
the culture is the thing that people look at. That's actually who we are. What we choose to worship and what we choose, meaning value, what we choose to create. That's who we are. That's the mark we're going to leave. That's the legacy.
100%. And we have such an inherent bias in our education system from the very beginning. You know, like I went to Catholic school to my detriment. And that's, I blame that for a lot of the, you know, for the fact that I don't know how to dance and I don't feel a lot of those. I was taught to suppress. You know?
I've seen a lot of girls who went to Catholic school who are very good dancers.
Okay, point taken. But my point is that it's not really that. My point is that, like, in our education system, we're taught a small sliver of the truth.
Yes.
And some people are, including myself, are just so late to the game to understand that there's so much more truth out there. Studying Anthony Braxton over the years, one of the great gifts is that he's pointed me towards, you know, ancient Egypt. He's made me realize that, like you said, you know, the things that we choose to worship are what define us. Right now in this country, it's capitalism. It's money, baby. That's like the one thing, or as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
That's why we have the dumb shit in office that's exclusively why, because of the, you know, not even because of real wealth, but because of the perception of wealth. And, but that seems like such a mammoth thing to overcome. I mean, in a small way, just by creating artwork, just by creating a podcast, just by maybe sharing a YouTube video that 1,000 people might see. Those are a small way of being an advocate for true value in humanity, like for the real thing. But how do you convince people that there's so much more that we aren't even aware of? Like, it's a problem that people don't even know that is a problem.
Well, let's leave it there. That's why we do this work. I mean, that's what we're doing.
Exactly.
Whether it's one person at a time, one conversation at a time, that's what we're doing, you know? Brian Krock, what a pleasure, man.
Thank you so much for having me. Wow, this was a fascinating conversation. I did not expect it to go the many circuitous paths that it went, but I had a blast. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it, Leo.
There it was, my friends, the circuitous conversation with the curious Brian Krock. If you'd like to be considered to be interviewed on this podcast, simply arrange for everyone I know to say your name to me in the space of 1 or 2 weeks. I'll be back again before you know it with another deep dive. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.